His mouth hovered a breath above my collarbone, and the heat radiating off his tattooed chest made my knees buckle like I'd been struck by lightning. My fingers clawed into the ink-stretched skin of his shoulders, tracing the serpentine dragon coiling down his bicep while his jaw clenched so tight I could see every muscle ripple beneath that golden-brown skin. The way he looked at me, like I was the only sin worth damning himself for, made every guilty thought in my skull dissolve into pure, molten want. I tasted salt and expensive whiskey on his lower lip, and God help me, I pulled him closer, my hips pressing against the hard ridge of his slacks while Seoul glittered 63 floors below us like a city that would never forgive what we were about to become. You need to understand something before I tell you how I ended up pressed against the floor-to-ceiling glass of Prosecutor Kwon Jae-hyun's penthouse office. My conscience shredded like wet paper. 3 weeks earlier, I was Amara Osei, 23, Ghanaian-born, raised between Accra and London, now working as a junior legal translator at the Seoul Central District Prosecutor's Office. I had a boyfriend, a good one, Daniel, a Nigerian-British architect who called me my golden girl every morning and left voice notes that made my coworkers roll their eyes with envy. I had a life built on loyalty, on the unshakable belief that love meant choosing the same person every single day without flinching. Then they assigned me to translate deposition files for the Special Investigations Division. Then I met him. Kwon Jae-hyun was 29, and the entire building whispered his name like a cursed prayer. They called him the Ice Scalpel, the man who dismantled corporate empires with the emotional detachment of a surgeon removing a tumor. 6'2" of densely packed muscle that his tailored charcoal suits couldn't hide, broad shoulders that strained the fabric, forearms thick with veins that pulsed when he gripped his fountain pen, a neck like a column of carved mahogany. And the tattoos. God, the tattoos. They crept from beneath his crisp white collar in deliberate black lines. A geometric mandala spanning his left deltoid, Korean script tracing his right trapezius, and when he rolled his sleeves during late-night case reviews, I could see the elaborate hanbok pattern sleeve covering his entire left forearm, the ink so vivid it looked freshly wounded into his skin. He never smiled. Not once in 3 weeks. He'd hand me documents with those long, ink-stained fingers and say, "Translate. Precisely. By 9. His voice was a low baritone that vibrated in my sternum like a cello string plucked in an empty cathedral. His eyes, dark, narrow, perpetually assessing, swept over me the way a judge surveys evidence. Clinical, detached, devastating. And I hated how my body responded, how my breath hitched when he leaned over my desk to point at a mistranslated clause, his cologne, sandalwood and cold steel, flooding my senses, how my thighs pressed together under my skirt when his knuckles accidentally brushed mine reaching for the same file folder, how I replayed the sound of his voice at 2 a.m. in my tiny Gangnam apartment while Daniel slept peacefully in the next room, oblivious. The guilt was a living thing. It sat in my throat like a stone. Growing heavier each day, I walked into that sterile, fluorescent-lit office and felt the gravitational pull of a man who hadn't spoken more than 12 words to me outside of work instructions. I told myself it was nothing, a fleeting attraction, the novelty of proximity. I was committed. I was faithful. I was Amara Osei, and I did not do this. But Seoul in November has a way of cracking people open. The wind off the Han River cuts through wool coats like a blade, and the city runs on soju-fueled confessions and neon-lit loneliness. Professional reputations here aren't just careers. They're identities, legacies, the sum total of a person's worth compressed into a business card. One scandal, one whispered rumor in the right elevator, and a decade of climbing evaporates. Everyone in that building walked on eggshells around Kwon Jae-hyun because his reputation was a fortress, and mine was a threadbare scarf in a blizzard. The night everything shattered started with a mistranslation. Not mine. A senior translator had botched a critical financial deposition, and the case deadline was midnight. Jae-hyun's assistant called me at 7 p.m., voice tight with panic. "Prosecutor Kwon needs you. Now." His office. "Bring the original Korean files." I arrived at 7:40, still in my work blouse, a fitted cream silk that Daniel had bought me in London, and a pencil skirt that hugged my hips in a way I suddenly became very aware of as the elevator climbed. 63 floors. My reflection stared back at me in the polished steel doors. Full lips, wide dark eyes, the gold hoops catching the overhead light. My natural hair was pulled back in a low puff, tendrils escaping to frame my jaw. I looked composed. I looked professional. I did not look like a woman about to commit the most catastrophic moral failure of her 23 years. His office was a monument to controlled violence. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the Seoul skyline bleeding orange and violet into the November dark. The desk was obsidian black, immaculate, not a paper out of alignment. Bookshelves lined one wall. Legal texts, philosophy, a single volume of Yoon Dongju poetry that seemed almost tender among the spines. The lighting was surgical, white, unforgiving. It made everything look like evidence under examination. He was standing at the window when I entered, back to me, phone pressed to his ear. The suit jacket was gone. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled to the elbows, revealing the full architecture of his forearms. The hanbok sleeve tattoo, the geometric patterns, the Korean characters that I now knew read, "Truth cuts deepest." His shoulders were impossibly broad, the trapezius muscles flexing as he shifted the phone. A black tribal band circled his right bicep, disappearing under the rolled fabric. He ended the call, turned. Those eyes found mine, and the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. "Sit," he said. "Not a request. A verdict." I sat. He dropped the mistranslated files on the desk between us with a sound like a gavel striking wood. "Fix it. Every clause. Every financial figure. You have until midnight." He pulled a chair to the opposite side of the desk, sat, and began reviewing case notes with the absolute disinterest of a man who had already forgotten I existed. For 2 hours, the only sounds were my pen scratching, his fountain pen scratching, and the distant hum of the city below. The silence was a physical weight. I could feel him breathing, could see, in my peripheral vision, the way his jaw worked when he read something that displeased him, the way his tattooed fingers flexed around the pen, the way a single vein pulsed at his temple. At 10 he stood, walked to a cabinet, and poured 2 glasses of something amber. Set one in front of me without looking up. "Drink. You're translating slower." I shouldn't have. I drank. The whiskey burned a golden trail down my throat, and something in my chest loosened. A knot I'd been carrying for 3 weeks without naming it. At 11, he moved to my side of the desk to point at a discrepancy. His chest was inches from my shoulder. I could smell him, sandalwood, ink, the faint metallic tang of cold November air clinging to his skin. His finger traced the line of text, and his knuckle grazed the bare skin of my wrist where my blouse sleeve had ridden up. Neither of us moved. The contact lasted 2 seconds, maybe 3. His skin was warm, impossibly warm against the clinical chill of that office. I felt the rough texture of a small tattoo on his knuckle, a tiny geometric shape I'd never noticed before. My pulse hammered so violently I was certain he could feel it through his fingertip. He withdrew his hand, slowly, deliberately, like pulling a blade from a wound. "Continue," he murmured, but his voice had changed. The cello string had been plucked again, lower this time, rougher. A hairline fracture in the ice. At 11:40, I made a mistake. I looked up from the documents and found him already watching me. Not the clinical assessment I'd grown accustomed to. Something else. Something hungry and terrified in equal measure. His dark eyes tracked the movement of my lips as I mouthed a Korean phrase, testing the translation. They dropped to my throat, where my pulse was visibly fluttering beneath the skin. They lingered on the curve where my collarbone disappeared into silk. "Prosecutor Kwan," I whispered. My voice sounded foreign. "Rect. Jae-hyun," he corrected. The first time he'd offered his given name. It landed in my chest like a brand. The silence that followed was the loudest sound I'd ever heard. He stood, rounded the desk. Each step was measured, predatory, inevitable. He stopped in front of my chair, and I had to tilt my head back to meet his gaze. From this angle, the mandala tattoo on his deltoid was fully visible through the stretched white cotton, the geometric lines shifting with his breath. His shadow swallowed me whole. You should leave, he said. His voice was gravel and restraint. A man holding back a flood with his bare hands. You have someone waiting at home. I know. The words tasted like ash. Then why are you still sitting in my office at midnight, Amara? He said my name like he'd been practicing it in private. Like it cost him something to release it into the air. The way the vowels rounded in his mouth, Korean consonants softening around the Ghanaian syllables, made my entire body clench with a want so sharp it was almost pain. I stood. We were inches apart. I could see the individual ink dots of his tattoo, the faint scar bisecting his left eyebrow, the way his nostrils flared as he breathed me in. His chest rose and fell, the white shirt straining across pectorals that were obscenely defined. The tribal band on his bicep flexed as his hands curled into fists at his sides. Because I've been translating your words for 3 weeks, I said, my voice barely a thread. And I can't stop hearing them when I close my eyes. Something broke behind his expression. The ice scalpel. The man who dismantled empires without blinking. His jaw tightened, released, tightened again. A muscle feathered in his cheek. And then his hand, large, warm, rough-palmed, ink-stained, came up and cupped my jaw. His thumb traced my lower lip with a reverence that made my vision blur. This is a mistake, he breathed. His forehead dropped to mine. His breath was hot, whiskey-sweet, devastating. I will ruin you. I will ruin myself. The entire division will. I know. His mouth crashed onto mine. Not gentle. Not tentative. Collision. A detonation. His lips were firm and demanding, tasting of oak and fire, and his tongue swept into my mouth with the same ruthless precision he applied to cross-examinations. I gasped, and he swallowed the sound, his fingers tangling in the tendrils escaping my hair, tilting my head to deepen the angle. His other hand found the small of my back, pressing me against the hard plane of his stomach, and I felt every ridge of muscle through that thin white cotton, felt the heat of him searing through my blouse like a brand. I kissed him back with 3 weeks of starved, guilty, obsessive wanting. My hands fisted in his shirt, pulling, dragging the fabric taut across his shoulders. He groaned. A low, broken sound torn from somewhere deep in his chest, and lifted me. Simply lifted me, one hand under my thigh, the other splayed across my back, and I wrapped my legs around his waist, my skirt riding up, my heels dangling 63 floors above the Han River. He carried me to the window, pressed me against the glass. The city sprawled behind me, a million lights witnessing, and his mouth was on my throat, his teeth grazing the sensitive skin below my ear, his tongue tracing the tendon there while his hips ground forward, and I felt the hard, undeniable evidence of his want pressing against me through 2 layers of fabric. My back arched off the glass. A whimper escaped me. Shameless, desperate, nothing like the composed translator who'd walked in 4 hours ago. Amara, my name again. Prayer. Condemnation. His lips moved down my collarbone, his stubble scraping my skin raw, his breath hot and ragged against the silk of my blouse. His tattooed fingers found the buttons, undid them. 1, 2, 3. His knuckles brushed the swell of my chest through my lace bra, and I shuddered so violently the glass behind me vibrated. Look at me, he commanded. Rough, wrecked, nothing like the prosecutor who spoke in clipped sentences and surgical precision. His eyes were blown wide, dark, fevered. The ice scalpel was gone. Beneath him was a man starving. A man who hadn't touched another person in God knows how long, who'd built a fortress of reputation and silence and cold, and who was now watching me with an expression of such raw, terrified hunger that my heart cracked clean in 2. I pulled his shirt open. The mandala tattoo spread across his pectoral in intricate geometric lines. The Korean script on his trapezius. A phoenix rising across his right ribcage, its wings spanning the hard planes of his obliques. I traced each line with my fingertips, and he hissed through his teeth, his head dropping back, the column of his throat exposed, the tribal band flexing as his arms tightened around me. You're going to destroy me, he whispered. Not an accusation, a surrender. Then be destroyed. I breathed back, and I kissed the phoenix on his ribs, felt his entire body seize, felt his fingers dig into my hips hard enough to bruise. What followed was a dismantling. Slow, deliberate, obsessive. He laid me on the obsidian desk, scattering legal documents like fallen leaves, and his mouth mapped every inch of exposed skin with the thoroughness of a man building a case he intended to win. My collarbones, the dip of my throat, the soft skin of my inner wrist where my pulse raced, the curve of my hip where my skirt had bunched. Each kiss was a question. Each touch was a confession. His rough palms against my smooth skin, his stubble against my softness, the contrast of his ink-stained fingers on my dark brown thighs, the visual poetry of his geometric tattoos pressing against the gold brown of my stomach. I pulled him down by the tribal band on his bicep, wrapping my legs around him, feeling the full weight of him, dense, muscular, overwhelming, settling over me. His forehead pressed to mine. Our breath mingled, hot, desperate, alive. "Say my name," I whispered. A demand, a need. Amara, broken, reverent, like he was speaking a language he'd just learned. Amara, Amara. Each repetition a little more ragged, a little more undone. The night unspooled in fragments. The cold glass against my shoulder blades. The heat of his chest against my front. The sound of his breathing shattering from controlled to wrecked. The way he murmured Korean endearments against my temple. Words I couldn't translate, didn't need to translate, because the meaning was in the vibration, the desperation, the way his voice cracked on the second syllable. The way my fingers traced every tattoo like reading scripture, and the way he arched into each touch like a man receiving absolution. At some point, the city lights dimmed. At some point, the whiskey glasses sat empty. At some point, the legal documents were scattered across the floor like casualties of a war neither of us intended to fight. At some point, I forgot Daniel's name, forgot my apartment, forgot the word faithful and everything it had meant 24 hours ago. There was only the weight of him, the ink on his skin, the sound of my own voice, unrecognizable, saying things I'd never say in daylight, the feeling of his callous palms spanning my waist, lifting, positioning, claiming, the way he watched me, always watching with those dark, fevered eyes, as if memorizing evidence for a case he'd spend the rest of his life litigating in the court of his own conscience. When it was over, when the last tremor left my body and his forehead dropped to my shoulder, his breath scorching my skin, his whispered, "I'm sorry," barely audible. I lay on that obsidian desk staring at the ceiling and felt the full, annihilating weight of what I'd done. He rolled to the side, sat up, ran a hand through his disheveled hair, and the movement pulled his shirt open further, revealing the full phoenix tattoo, the geometric mandala, the script. He looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw my own destruction reflected back. Not judgment, something worse, recognition. The look of a man who'd just discovered he was capable of the very human weakness he'd spent a career prosecuting in others. "Go home, Amara," he said, quiet, final, a verdict delivered to himself as much as to me. I dressed in silence, buttoned the silk blouse with shaking fingers, smoothed my skirt, pinned my hair, rebuilt the architecture of composure brick by brick. At the door I turned. He was still sitting on the edge of the desk, shirt open, tattoos exposed, staring at the scattered documents on the floor like they were the ruins of a civilization he'd accidentally bombed. "Jae-hyun." He looked up. "This doesn't change what I am," I said. My voice was steady. My hands were not. "But it changes what I know I'm capable of. And I don't know which terrifies me more." He nodded. Once. Slow. The ice scalpel reassembling himself, piece by piece, in the sterile white light. But his eyes stayed warm, stayed wrecked, stayed mine for one more second before the frost returned. I walked out, took the elevator down, 63 floors of silence, stepped into the November wind off the Han River and let it freeze the tears on my cheeks before they could fall. I went home. Daniel was asleep. I lay beside him in the dark, staring at the ceiling, feeling the ghost of tattooed fingers on my skin, tasting sandalwood and whiskey on a tongue that wasn't his. The guilt didn't crash. seeped, slow, cold, permanent, like ink into skin, like a sentence you can't appeal. And the worst part, the part that kept me awake until the Seoul sky turned gray and the first trains rattled beneath our window, wasn't the guilt. It was that I'd do it again. If you've ever felt the terrifying electricity of wanting something so badly it rewrites your entire moral code, if you've ever stood at the edge of a decision and felt the ground give way beneath you, hit that like button right now. Drop a comment telling me, have you ever been undone by someone you shouldn't have wanted? Because I need to know I'm not the only one who stood in that sterile office, heart hammering, knowing the next breath changes everything. And if this story made your chest ache the way mine ached writing it, subscribe to AMBW Romance Stories and share this with someone who needs to feel seen in their most complicated, human, unforgivable wanting. You are not alone in the wanting. You never were. I never went back to the Special Investigations Division. I requested a transfer the following Monday. Kwon Jae-hyun signed the paperwork without looking up, without speaking. His pen scratched across the form, the same fountain pen, the same tattooed fingers, and he slid it back across the obsidian desk without meeting my eyes. But on my last day, I found a single sheet of paper on my keyboard. No signature, no header, just a line of Korean script in that precise surgical handwriting. I translated it 3 times before I believed it. The truth cuts deepest, but some truths are worth the bleeding. I folded it, put it in my coat pocket, walked out of the Seoul Central District Prosecutor's office for the last time, into the November wind, into the rest of a life I would spend trying to forgive myself for wanting. Daniel and I lasted another 4 months. He never knew. The guilt was mine to carry, and I carried it like a stone in my chest, smooth and heavy and permanent. Some nights, in the blue glow of 3 a.m., I'd press my fingertips to my collarbone and feel the phantom scrape of stubble, the ghost of a whisper, Amara, 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 and the wanting would rise like a tide I couldn't hold back. And somewhere in a high-rise 63 floors above the Han River, a man with ink-stained fingers and a phoenix across his ribs sat alone in a sterile office, translating his own silence into something he could live with. We never spoke again. But God help me, I still hear his voice in every quiet room. Thank you for staying with me through every aching, guilty, electric second of this story. If Amara's night in that Seoul high-rise made your heart race, made you feel the weight of wanting something you shouldn't, made you press your hand to your chest and whisper, yes, I know that feeling, then you belong here. Subscribe to AMBW Romance Stories. Turn on that notification bell, because every single day, I'm bringing you stories that live in the spaces between right and wrong, between loyalty and longing, between the person you promised to be and the person you become when the lights go low and the right-wrong person looks at you like you're the only truth worth bleeding for. Share this story. Send it to your group chat. Send it to the friend who says they'd never, ever, ever. Because we all have a prosecutor Kwon in our history. We all have a night that rewired our souls. And you deserve a space where that complexity is honored, not judged. I'll see you in the next story, my beautiful, complicated, gloriously human people. Until then, carry your stones gently. And remember, the truth cuts deepest, but some truths are worth the bleeding. AMBW Romance Stories, where every love story is a little bit dangerous.